Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order. As a reminder, pursuant to Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11-2H4, the Chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered. And without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. As we call up this first bill, I just want to note one person who's actually leaving our staff, has been with us for a while, is going to work for our whip office. The person with that camera over there, Andrew, is leaving us, so we want to just give him a round of thanks and appreciation for all the work that he's done with us. It's been a great asset to our committee, and good people have good options, and the whip's office asked for him, and we said yes, sir, reluctantly, but great opportunity for him, and we thank him for his service to this committee. Our first item for consideration is H.R. 756, the Postal Service Reform Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 756, to restore the financial solvency and improve the governance of the United States Postal Service in order to ensure the efficient and affordable nationwide delivery of mail and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I intend to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. Without objection, we will call up the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and then I will recognize myself to give one statement on both the ANS and the underlying bill. The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 756, offered by Mr. Chaffetz of Utah.
Thank you. This is a big day. We've been working on a postal reform bill for quite some time. This is the next step in a process that has been very bipartisan from start to finish. I want to thank our ranking member, a good friend, Elijah Cummings, for his tireless work on this. I also want to recognize Mr. Mark Meadows. He's the chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee. He has poured so much time and effort meeting with group after group and talking and helping us to get to the point where we are today, and I can't thank him enough, as well as Dennis Ross. Dennis, we're welcome back on the committee. He's spent time heading the subcommittee prior to his departure to another committee, but we're thrilled to have him back and glad that he's an integral part of this. I also want to thank Mr. Russell of Oklahoma. He's been a real champion here and recognizes the deep need for these reforms and his participation in the configuration of this bill. It also wouldn't have been possible without Jerry Conley, Mr. Stephen Lynch, and Brenda Lawrence, each of which have vast experience and commitment on these types of things. And so I'd like to welcome Mr. Conley here. Normally we'd have the audience all stand as he comes in, but we'll forego that. But we do thank Mr. Conley, Mr. Lynch, and Ms. Lawrence as well for their good work. And we're also pleased that Glenn G.T. Thompson, a Republican member out of Pennsylvania, as well as Tim Ryan, the Democrat from Ohio, have also joined us co-sponsoring this bill. The United States Postal Service has been a vital tool of commerce in our nation for more than 200 years, and each day the Postal Service delivers hundreds of millions of pieces of mail. It affects literally every single American, and it just works. People are, I think if they stopped and understood the complexity of how you put a stamp on a letter and suddenly it shows up in your mailbox, it really is quite an amazing feat. In doing so, the Postal Service provides a seamless connection to all Americans, no matter your income, socioeconomic status, whether you're digitally connected or not, whether you live in rural America or you live in a big metropolitan area. But the United States Postal Service is at risk, and we've known this for some time, and the vital tool is nearing a fiscal insolvency. Really what we're trying to do and prevent is a bailout. I've had a chance to chat with a number of people from the President of the United States to constituents in my own district about this, and I will say it again, I've said it many, many times, it is a tool of commerce. It's the kind of thing that needs to work in our economy. It is a competitive advantage for the United States of America. But we need to recognize that the Postal Service has $119 billion in unfunded liabilities. These liabilities include more than $52 billion in earned but unfunded retiree health care. These liabilities also include $21 billion in unfunded pension liabilities and $18 billion for workers' compensation. In addition, the Postal Service has maxed out its $15 billion line of credit from the Treasury Department. The negative effect of the unfunded liabilities and debt has been compounded by the significant decreases in total mail volume. Mail volume is down roughly 25% since 2006. Struggling to handle volume loss and its unfunded liabilities, the Postal Service has posted multi-billion-dollar deficits 10 years in a row. But I also would wish that America and the rest of our government would recognize that the Postal Service and certainly the workers have done a lot to try to curb this very difficult financial situation. Since 2006, the Postal Service has cut annual expenses by $15 billion. They have cut the workforce by roughly 200,000 career employees. They additionally cut annual workloads by 331 million. They consolidated 360 of their facilities and 20,000 of their delivery routes, all at the same time where they're having to add, by mandate, nearly 900,000 new addresses to deliver to each and every year. Despite these major internal reforms, the Postal Service's financial situation remains bleak. Legislative reform is necessary to restore the financial health of the agency. This committee has worked on a very good bipartisan legislation for the last several years. I want to thank Chairman Issa for his work in helping to push forward postal reform, and we incorporated many of those ideas, as many as we possibly could, into this bill as well. Today, our bipartisan coalition includes Ranking Member Cummings, Government Operations Chairman Meadows, Mr. Conley, Mr. Lynch, Mr. Ross, Mr. Russell, Ms. Lawrence, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Ryan. But I can say that definitively, at least from my opinion, we have a very good bill. Each of us would like to see things done a little bit differently, but in the nature and the spirit of compromise, I think what we have before us today is a very solid bill. This bill, H.R. 756, the Postal Service Reform Act of 2017, will allow the Postal Service to take the necessary steps forward. The bill is a result of feedback provided by members, the Postal Service, postal unions, mailers, printers, publishers, nonprofits, and others. The major supporters of this bill, those who have been able to actually put their organizations and names in writing in support of this, include the Coalition for a 21st Century Postal Service, the American Catalog Mailers Association, the Parcel Shippers Association, the Bank of America, Federal Express, Overstock.com, Amazon, Verizon, Pitney Bowes, the Postal Service Management Associations, the National Association of, which includes the National Association of Postal Supervisors, the United Postmasters and Managers of America, and postal unions, including the American Postal Workers Association, the National Association of Letter Carriers, National Rural Letters Carriers Association, and the National Postal Mail Handlers Union. We appreciate all of these organizations working with us to come up with the bill that is today, and you can see the cross-section of organizations and unions and others that we have that are here in support of this bill. I really do believe this is a true path forward because the legislation allows the Postal Service to adopt private sector best practices for retiree health care. The Medicare integration provision alone will save the Postal Service $30 billion over the next 10 years and eliminate $50 billion in unfunded liability. This bill also increases the Postal Service's delivery efficiency by increasing the use of secure and centralized delivery units. The bill includes vital reforms to streamline the Postal Service Board of Governors, strengthening the Postal Regulatory Commission, and allow the Postal Service to work with state and local governments. We're very encouraged by the feedback that we have received along the way, and we'd like to think that we listened to that and incorporated it into the bill. I look forward to a good markup today. And with that, I will yield back and recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I truly want to thank you for your tremendous leadership on this issue. Let me say to all of us that there are moments when we try to reach common ground this bill takes us to higher ground. This is a bill where so many of us had certain desires that we hoped would be in the bill that didn't get there. Others got certain things. But the chairman is absolutely right. This is a bill of compromise. Don't forget what I said. Not common ground, but higher ground. Putting party aside and making sure that we would do what's best for not only the postal system, but for the nation. And hopefully when all the dust settles on this bill, people will look back and say, this is the way Congress should operate. This is the way we should elevate. This is the way we should do our best for the American people. We would not be here today if you, Mr. Chairman, had not made postal reform a priority. You kept your word. So often, Mr. Chairman, what happens is that people in one Congress work on something, and then if you cannot finish it, they just throw it away. And then you start all over again, which is stupid. I'm so glad that what you did was to take a product that Mr. Issa and so many others, Mr. Ross, had worked so hard on, Mr. Connolly, Mr. Lynch, and said, you know what, I'm not throwing this out. I'm going to take it, and I'm going to try to make it better. And you did just that. And so I want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Meadows, Connolly, Lynch, Ross, Russell, Lawrence, for their dedication, and you, Mr. Chairman, to postal reform and extraordinary work in crafting a bipartisan measure that we can all support. The bill before us is a product of more than a year, more like 3 or 4 years, of intense negotiations that began last Congress, and is a result of broader efforts that have been underway for years. Last Congress, we took a bipartisan approach. We tailored our bill to focus on essential provisions that would address the Postal Service's most urgent challenges. And that's one of the things that the chairman emphasized. He said, well, we may not be able to bring a cure to all the problems, but at least let's try to concentrate on those things that are most important and those things that we possibly can find agreement on, and let's not let our differences destroy our possibilities of accomplishing great things. So narrowing the scope of the legislation enabled us to garner support from both sides of the aisle. And I'm reminding the members of the committee, this is a real delicate balance. You know, I know a lot of you all have amendments that you've been dreaming about all night. But you know, wait till next year. We want to get this through right now. In crafting the legislation, we also took into consideration the comments of stakeholders, including 50 organizations, many of which the chairman just mentioned, and entities and nearly 150 members of the public. So this was an open process. And one of the reasons why it was an open process is because we were determined to have buy-in, as much buy-in as possible. And to all of you, and I'm not going to name you in the audience, but I want to thank all of you for your contributions. Every syllable, every word, every negative thought, every prayer, we thank you. We were able to introduce and pass out of committee a reform bill last Congress, but unfortunately time ran out. The measure before us is substantially similar to the bill from last Congress. I will be the first to admit that this bill is not perfect. It does not include everything. It does not include everything the majority wanted, but it does include the most critical elements. The reality is we must be willing to compromise. And I'll say that over and over and over again. Our bill asks everyone to sacrifice to accomplish our shared goal, which is putting the Postal Service on a sound financial path that will ensure its long-term viability. This bill gives us the best chance we have to enact meaningful postal reform in this Congress. I want to highlight some of the provisions in the bill. This legislation would ensure that all retirees who are eligible for Medicare will be enrolled in Medicare automatically. This is something that I know Mr. Connolly spent a phenomenal amount of time working on. I want to thank you, sir, for all your hard work on that. Let me point out that the Postal Service and its employees and retirees have already paid a total of almost $30 billion since 1983 for Medicare, but some retirees are not receiving a benefit in return. Without this change, the Postal Service cannot achieve financial stability. This bill would ensure that a transition fund will be created to help newly enrolled retirees pay some of their premiums in the first 3 years. This bill would strengthen postal governance by shrinking the Board of Governors, investing in it responsibility for setting overall strategy and approving prices and products. Day-to-day executive authority and the Postmaster General would remain with the Postmaster General. The bill also would increase postal rates for market-dominant products by 2.15% or 1 cent for the first-class stamps. I wish we had been able to expand the Postal Service's authority to offer non-postal products further, but I am pleased that this bill would create the Chief Innovation Officer position, something for which I have been advocating over the last several years. As I close, let me be clear that continued delay in enactment of postal reform is simply not an option. The threats to the Postal Service's financial condition are clear, and ladies and gentlemen, they are imminent. And if we do not intervene to help the Postal Service, a liquidity crisis will be simply unavoidable. Enacting postal reform in this Congress is now more urgent than ever because the Postal Service is now operating without any sitting Senate-confirmed board members. According to the Postal Service's Office of Inspector General, there are numerous management responsibilities that by statute can be exercised only by the governors. The Postal Inspector General has noted that the lack of board members may be highly problematic, stating, and I quote, "The Postal Service's constitutional authority to take certain actions could be in question," end of quote. This underscores the need to accomplish postal reform this Congress. The substitute amendment makes some minor technical changes to the underlying bill by requiring the Postal Inspector General to report to the Board of Governors and clarifying how postal rate increase would be applied. We made great progress on postal reform, and the lack of any members on the Board of Governors adds to the urgency. We must not waver. We must press ahead, and we must push this legislation over the finish line. And with that, Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I also want to recognize the National Newspaper Association, who's also with us here in the audience and very helpful in this process as we had moved forward. Do any other members wish to speak on the bill or the amendment in the nature of the substitute? Mr. Issa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I want to congratulate you and the ranking member on moving a consensus bill as far as you have. Although I will be offering some amendments today, my goal is to ensure that the progress you've made and those before you continues. I think that, as the ranking member said, rightfully so, we have reached a crisis point with the postal system, not just because of the absence of a board, but because of the failure to pay amounts which are statutorily obligated. And we have to not only, quite frankly, forgive that and restructure, but we also have to ensure that, unlike 2006, where a fix was put in by the House, the Senate, and President Bush that we thought would last for a considerable period of time, only to discover it didn't even have 1 year of profitability, that we structure this so that profitability, and I use that term loosely, but a sufficient revenue to pay all expenses that remain under this new program and make at least some limited investments in modernizing the fleet and in other areas that will allow the Post Office to have a real role into the mid-21st century. And I'll close by saying this. I've met with a number of the stakeholders, and when I see stakeholders such as Amazon putting in lockers in 10,000 communities around America, I see that, in fact, they have adopted the concept of cluster boxes. They do so now around the postal system. They use their own vehicles. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and that's a perfectly good business plan. But if we modernize the Post Office, if we streamline it, then the letter carriers of today should be the most efficient way to deliver to every area of homes in the country. And it's your goal, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, to get the Post Office there. It's also my goal, and I thank you for bringing this markup today, and I yield back.
If the gentleman will yield.
Of course I would yield.
I just again want to thank Chairman Issa for the good work and the foundation you laid. We wouldn't be able to get to this spot without the foundation that you and the staff that you worked with, and I appreciate that. And I just want to thank you for your good work on this, and look forward to continuing to work with you on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I only wanted them to yield.
I would further yield to the Ranking Member.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. I think Mr. Connolly wanted you to yield to him, Ms. Issa.
Well, then I'll yield back.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
I thank the Chair. This is a signal moment, I think, for our committee and actually for the U.S. Congress. And credit goes to you, Mr. Chairman, and to you, Mr. Ranking Member, Mr. Cummings, and the group of us that held together, and to all of the stakeholders who participated and gave us their best thoughts. This is a delicate balance, and what's at stake is the future of the United States Postal Service. And this is our best attempt to undo the damage done in 2006, unintentionally, I think, by Congress, but nonetheless done, and to put the Postal Service back on the road to solvency and profitability, and to be a 21st century instrument to serve the people of this country. We've done it in a bipartisan way. We've done it with almost universal endorsement. Some would say, well, it's not a perfect bill. I'd like to meet the perfect bill. There is no such thing. I wish there were, because then the health care debate would be over. We'd have a perfect health care bill, or a perfect tax reform bill, or a perfect immigration bill. There is no such thing. We can't, we do the best we can, and I think this is better than that. This represents some of the best thinking, and we've done it in cooperation with the Postmaster General, who has, I think, been a very valuable ally and partner. I do want to caution. I listened to Mr. Issa tell us he's going to have some amendments, and I want to say to all of my colleagues here, we need to be careful. This is a carefully crafted bill. Changing one moving part affects all the others. For example, were we to adopt an amendment that would have the effect of cutting 6-day delivery to 5, we will lose a majority of the House of Representatives on this bill. Last Congress, I circulated with Republican Mr. Graves a letter insisting on 6-day delivery. That letter had 241 sponsors, including many Republicans. So far this year, the new letter has 151 people, but counting, including 38 Republicans. If we take the bait and adopt an amendment that has the effect of returning us from 6 to 5, it will, I think, kill the chance of this bill on the floor, as it did the previous 7 years. So this bill avoids fights we don't need to have, and avoids extraneous issues like 6-day delivery versus 5. And I credit the chairman and ranking member for recognizing that, and I credit the Postmaster General for recognizing that. That's not a fight we ought to have. We ought to be dealing with the essentials, and that's what this bill does. So we need to resist the temptation to make a policy expression that some may believe in and most of us don't, but that will have the effect of killing the bill. And so I want to keep this bill together. I've made compromises too, as has the chairman and the ranking member and the other members of the coalition. And I hope we can bring this bill primarily intact to the floor so we can give it a chance on the floor of the House of Representatives and activate our colleagues in the Senate. This is perhaps our last best hope for putting the Postal Service back into solvency. This isn't just a nice bipartisan thing to do. It's critical to the future of the U.S. Postal Service. And I hope we take this opportunity today and pass this bill as is. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize Mr. Ross of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all the hard work that you have done, the ranking member have done, and I'm proud to support this bill and to be an original co-sponsor. Since 2006, the Postal Service has seen mail volume decrease by more than 25% and has lost money for 10 straight years. Along with this declining mail volume, the Postal Service holds $119 billion in unfunded liabilities. The Postal Service is quickly approaching financial insolvency, and we must act now to ensure its survival and to prevent a taxpayer-funded bailout. I am proud to have joined H.R. 756 as an original co-sponsor because I believe it is a solid, bipartisan solution. The bill includes a number of reforms to help the agency cut costs, streamline its governance, and increase accountability. For example, these reforms include shrinking the number of Postal Service governors from 9 to 5 and strengthening the roles of the Postmaster General and the roles of the Postal Regulatory Commission. There's one other provision that I believe that is very key to the success of the bill. That provision is the review of cost attribution at the Postal Service. The rise of the Internet and e-commerce has significantly changed the way Americans interact with mail over the last 10 years. Today, Americans send a lot few letters, but they receive a lot more packages. Naturally, this has led the Postal Service to evolve and grow its package delivery operations, which compete directly with the private sector. As the Postal Service continues to expand into this market, it is important that the Postal Service is accurately capturing its costs to avoid inappropriately subsidizing its competitive product operation. H.R. 756 directs the Postal Regulatory Commission to conduct a review of the Postal Service's cost allocation methodologies to ensure they properly capture the costs of the organization's business model. The Postal Service is in need of a legislative solution to put the agency on track to financial solvency. I believe H.R. 756 is the bipartisan solution that accomplishes this goal. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say thank you to you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member, as well as our partners in this engagement, Mr. Meadows and Mr. Connolly, as well as Ms. Lawrence and the previous speaker, as well for their combined, Mr. Ross, of course, but for their combined work on this issue. So years ago, I was actually the chairman of the Postal Committee, so I've seen the steady menu of bills that varied from the mean-spirited to the draconian, that never saw the chance of getting to the floor or certainly passage. But to my colleagues here on the committee, congratulations on your willingness to compromise. There's a small group of people probably on each side that is not entirely happy, but that's what compromise is about. I want to say thank you to Postmaster General Brennan She has been a blessing to this whole process, and also to our postal unions, the letter carriers, the National Association of Letter Carriers, the American Postal Workers Union, the Mail Handlers Union, the supervisors, the postal managers, and postmasters. And also I want to just thank the mailing community, the newspapers, the magazines, the greeting cards groups. This really is a true consensus bill. This really is. There's plenty to like in this bill, but in each and every group there's a little bit that they don't like, which is probably the definition of success in today's Washington. I would join my colleague, Mr. Conley, in inviting some caution. This bill is in delicate balance, not only in this committee, but when it gets to the floor. And we need to get to 218 votes to pass this thing. And, the amendments, with all due respect to Mr. Issa, the former chairman of this committee, when nothing could get done, with all due respect, those amendments are a perfect example of why stuff does not happen in Washington, D.C. Those amendments are deal breakers. So if we want to have the Postal Service default on another $5.6 billion, then go ahead and everybody just offer amendments, and we'll see this thing crash and burn, and we'll go on and do something else. But if you want to see the best thing done for your constituents, and actually everybody's relying on this Postal Service, it delivers the mail to every home and business in America 6 days a week. I remember that debate that was so vociferous here just a few years ago when we said we're going to go to 5-day delivery, until Amazon said, no, the customers actually want 7-day, and now we're delivering more packages than ever. So we've reached a delicate compromise here, and I'm just imploring and beseeching my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I know there are some amendments on each side that were deeply considered, and I'm just asking to resist those. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, the very good in this case. And again, this would not have happened but for the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, and the gentleman from Baltimore, Mr. Cummings, taking the lead on that, as well as my colleagues, Mr. Conley and Mr. Meadows. So they have driven the bus on this, and I've been in all those meetings, and it's gotten ugly, but we're at a good result here. So please, let's get this behind us. Let's show the American people we can actually get our work done. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Members are advised that there is a vote on the floor, that a 3-vote series. We do intend to reconvene immediately after votes, and we encourage all members to attend. But prior to recessing, I would like to recognize Mr. Meadows for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership. It's easy in a day and age where someone makes a promise and then has a change in the political environment to not hold to that promise. And Mr. Chairman, you did that. You're a man of your word, and I think that everyone here would acknowledge the fact that things could have gone very differently. So I want to just acknowledge that today, Mr. Chairman. I also want to acknowledge all the stakeholders that are here. This bill would not be where we are without you, without your direct input. Some of you have me on your Christmas list, some of you do not, and I get that. But I also would like to thank the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, the gentleman from Maryland, certainly my good friend Jerry Conley and Steve Lynch for their work. This is one of those areas where there were compromises, and as Mr. Lynch said, it got ugly at times. Hopefully it never got personal, but it is a challenge as we look at this. I see this as a fundamental issue of a binary choice, and I'm not one that like to talk about binary choices, especially in this current political environment. But that being said, either we look at a bailout of the postal system of between $119 billion and $150 billion, depending on how you do the math, or we act now to make sure that we make the reforms necessary to have a vibrant postal service. I think this bill does it. It is not perfect. It is as perfect as we can get it in this environment to make it something that will pass the House and the Senate. So I look forward to supporting it. I urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you again. The intention of the chair is to reconvene immediately after votes. The committee will stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair. The committee stands in recess.